What if the baby lying in your arms right now, the one who cannot yet hold their own head up, who cannot speak or walk or feed themselves, who by every outward measure seems to be at the very beginning of knowing anything at all, is, in specific and measurable and scientifically verifiable ways, smarter than a chimpanzee, more curious than most adults, better at certain kinds of learning than any computer ever built, already in possession of a moral sense, a sense of justice, a theory of how physical objects behave, an understanding of basic arithmetic, an ability to read statistical patterns in the world, and a capacity to detect lies and unfairness that researchers have documented with elegant precision in experiments conducted with babies who are young enough to still be wearing diapers and who have no idea they are participating in one of the most astonishing series of scientific discoveries of the last 30 years. That is not a rhetorical flourish. It is not an exaggeration designed to make you feel good about babies. It is an accurate summary of what developmental cognitive science has established through careful and replicable experimentation about the interior life of the infant mind, and the reason most people do not know it, the reason the picture of the baby as an empty vessel waiting to be filled with knowledge by the adults around them has persisted so long and so stubbornly in the popular imagination is not that the evidence is ambiguous or contested, but that it is genuinely, radically counterintuitive, that it asks us to look at a creature who appears to know almost nothing and understand that appearances in this case are almost perfectly misleading, and that the knowledge hidden beneath the surface of infancy is so surprising in its nature and so consequential in its implications that sitting with it fully changes not just how you see babies, but how you see knowledge itself and learning itself, and the question of what it means to understand the world. Start with what researchers call core knowledge, the foundational set of principles that developmental scientists have found to be present in babies across every culture and every context they have studied. Principles so deeply woven into the structure of infant cognition that they appear not to be learned, but to be the framework within which learning happens, the prior knowledge that the baby's brain brings to every encounter with the world, rather than the knowledge it extracts from those encounters. And the scope of what falls under core knowledge is, when you lay it out in full, genuinely astonishing, because it includes a basic understanding of physical causality, of the behavior of solid objects, of the principle that objects cannot pass through each other or disappear into nothing, of the distinction between agents with goals and objects without them, of the rudiments of number and quantity, and of the social and moral principles that govern how agents ought to treat each other, all of it present in babies who are young enough that the idea of their possessing any of it seems almost impossible. And yet the evidence for each of these domains of infant knowledge is not anecdotal or impressionistic. It is experimental. It is the product of some of the most creative and rigorous scientific methodology that the field of developmental psychology has ever produced, methodology specifically designed to get around the baby's inability to speak or to perform deliberate actions, methodology that reads the baby's knowledge from the most honest and the most reliable signal the infant nervous system produces, the direction and the duration of their gaze. The logic of looking time research, which we touched on in an earlier script, is both simple and powerful. Babies, like adults, look longer at things that surprise them, things that violate their expectations about how the world works, things that should not be possible given what they understand about physical and social reality, and by constructing carefully controlled scenarios in which the laws of the world are either obeyed or subtly violated, and measuring how long the baby looks at each, researchers have built a remarkably detailed map of what the baby knows before anyone has had a chance to teach them anything. And the map is, every time you see it laid out in full, breathtaking. Take the domain of number and quantity. which is perhaps the most surprising of the core knowledge domains, because arithmetic seems like exactly the kind of thing that needs to be taught, that requires deliberate instruction and practice and cultural transmission, that nobody would expect to find in any form in a baby who has not yet been to school or even learned to count. And yet the research tells a different story, beginning with a now famous series of experiments conducted by Wynn at Yale in the early 1990s, in which babies as young as 5 months were shown a small number of objects being placed behind a screen and then shown either the expected number of objects when the screen was removed or a different impossible number, either too many or too few, and the babies looked significantly longer at the impossible outcome, demonstrating that they had tracked the number of objects being placed and had formed an expectation about how many should be behind the screen, an expectation that was violated when the wrong number appeared, which means that 5-month-old babies who have never heard the words 1 or 2 or 3, who have no language in which to represent quantity symbolically, who cannot point to the answer on a chalkboard or circle it on a test, were nonetheless tracking numerical quantity and responding with surprise when the arithmetic did not work out the way it should, demonstrating a form of numerical knowledge that is, in its basic structure, as real and as functional as the numerical knowledge of a child who has been taught to count, even though it operates below the level of language, below the level of symbolic representation, in a domain of pre-verbal quantitative intuition that the human brain appears to bring to the world rather than to extract from it. And Wynn's findings have been replicated, extended, and elaborated by researchers around the world in subsequent decades, with the age at which clear numerical sensitivity can be demonstrated pushed progressively younger, to 3 months, to 2 months, and in some paradigms to babies young enough that the question of whether they have had any experience that could have produced this sensitivity becomes genuinely difficult to answer, which is what pushes the evidence in the direction of an innate numerical sense rather than a rapidly learned one. Now here is the first twist that takes the story of infant knowledge somewhere that most people find genuinely and uncomfortably surprising. It is not just physical knowledge and numerical knowledge that babies bring to the world with them. It is knowledge about people, about social relationships, about fairness and helping and harm, about what agents ought to do and what they ought not to do. And the research on infant social and moral knowledge conducted over the last 15 years by researchers including Paul Bloom, Wynn, Kiley Hamlin, and their colleagues at the Yale Infant Cognition Center has produced a body of evidence that is, even within a field that has become accustomed to being surprised by babies, remarkable in its scope and its consistency. In studies using the now famous helper-hinderer paradigm that we visited in an earlier script, in which babies watch a puppet either help or hinder another character in achieving a goal, and are then given a choice between the two puppets, babies as young as 3 months show a clear and reliable preference for the helper and an equally clear avoidance of the hinderer, demonstrating that they have evaluated the social behavior of the two agents and formed a moral judgment about which one is better. Not just which one they prefer in some arbitrary sense, but which one behaved better in a morally relevant sense, which one did the right thing as opposed to the wrong thing. A distinction that requires understanding that agents have goals, that helping an agent toward their goal is good, and that blocking an agent from their goal is bad. All without language, all without explicit instruction, all in a brain that has been in the world for a few weeks or months, all demonstrating a form of moral reasoning that operates at a level of sophistication and consistency that, when you see it laid out as experimental data, makes it very difficult to maintain the belief that morality is exclusively a cultural and educational achievement rather than, at least partly, a biological one. And the moral knowledge of infants does not stop at the preference for helpers over hinderers. Subsequent research has shown that babies prefer fair distributors over unfair ones, that they respond with something that looks like indignation when resources are distributed unequally, that they distinguish between punishment that is deserved and punishment that is not, and that they show greater positive response toward agents who punish wrongdoers than toward agents who reward wrongdoers, suggesting that the infant moral sense includes not just a preference for pro-social behavior, but something approaching a rudimentary conception of justice, the sense that bad acts deserve bad consequences and good acts deserve good ones, a principle so abstract and so philosophically rich that its presence in a pre-verbal infant is, the more you think about it, the more extraordinary it becomes. Here is the second twist, and this one comes from a corner of infant cognitive research that is newer and even more mind-expanding than the moral knowledge work, because it concerns not what babies know but how they learn, specifically the finding that babies are not just passive accumulators of information from the environment, but are active, hypothesis-generating, theory-testing learners who behave in ways that are, in their deep structure, remarkably similar to the scientific method, who pay more attention to surprising information than to expected information, who use statistical regularity to extract rules from data, who treat their own attention and exploration as experiments designed to answer specific questions about how the world works, and who abandon theories that fail to predict what they observe in favor of theories that do. In other words, who are doing what scientists do, not as a learned professional practice, but as a natural and spontaneous mode of engaging with the world, a mode that appears to be the default setting of a curious and intelligent mind encountering a world that is more complex than any preset knowledge base could have fully anticipated. Alison Gopnik, whose work on infant cognition is among the most influential and the most beautifully written in the entire field, has described babies as the research and development department of the human species, the beings within the species who are most radically open to new information, most willing to revise their models, most capable of imaginative, counterfactual thinking, most free from the confirmation bias and the entrenched habits of interpretation that make adults so much less flexible as learners, however much more experienced and knowledgeable they may be. And this description, which might seem like a romantic overstatement, is actually a fairly precise summary of what the data shows, which is that in measures of cognitive flexibility, of willingness to update beliefs in the face of new evidence, of capacity to imagine how things could be different from how they are, young children and especially young babies consistently outperform adults, not because they know more, but because they know less. Because the very freshness and openness of a mind that has not yet committed heavily to any particular model of the world is what allows it to learn from everything with a completeness and an efficiency that a more experienced mind cannot match. What all of this comes down to, when you hold it all together and look at it as a whole, is a picture of the infant mind that is not just impressive in the way that a precocious child might be impressive, a little ahead of schedule, a little better at the expected things than expected, but impressive in a way that is philosophically significant, that challenges something deep about how we understand the relationship between knowledge and experience, between what we are born with and what we acquire, between the nature of the human mind and the culture through which that mind is expressed. The baby who knows more than you think is not a curiosity or an anomaly or a reason for parental pride in the ordinary sense. They are evidence of something about the human mind that we are only beginning to fully understand, which is that it arrives in the world not empty but structured, not ignorant but pre-equipped, not a passive receiver of whatever the world provides, but an active, curious, hypothesis-generating, theory-testing, morally sensitive, numerically aware, socially perceptive agent who brings to every encounter with experience a set of foundational tools and prior commitments that shape what they notice, what they remember, what surprises them, what they care about, and what kind of beings they are from the very first moment of their engagement with the world and the world that this baby is engaging with. The world of faces and voices and objects and quantities and social relationships and moral situations is not a world they are encountering for the first time and building their understanding of from scratch. It is a world they have been prepared to understand. A world that the long history of human evolution has spent millions of years writing the instruction manual for and then encoding that manual, not in a book or a school or a culture, but in the genome itself, in the developing brain, in the remarkable, extraordinary, endlessly surprising mind of every baby who has ever opened their eyes and begun the process of confirming, revising, and expanding everything they already somehow knew. Subscribe for more mind secrets.